What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the channel, or if it's your first time here, welcome to the channel. My name is Andrew, and today we're going over an article I found on thegamer.com. So I saw a video from a creator called Altiori. I love her stuff. And she was kind of talking about this article, and I had my own takes on the article, and I was like, you know what? This would be a good video, so let's go ahead and knock it out. And to start out, get yourself something to drink, get yourself a nice snack, come back and hang out with me. We're going to start this video off with the TLDR. Too long, didn't read, or in your case, TLDW, too long, didn't watch, right? So the short of it is, this article isn't mad about attractive female characters. It's mad that gamers like them without asking permission. If listening to player feedback and making characters people want to play is courting the wrong audience, then the audience you don't like. Removing ideology from a game isn't creating a new agenda unless you believe one ideology is the default and disagreement isn't allowed. At this point, diversity doesn't mean variety, it means ideological compliance. And this isn't criticism of a game, it's resentment toward people who play them, dressed up as cultural concern. You can't argue that attractive female protagonists are harmful while praising games that succeed because of them, unless the real issue isn't the design, but who you think is allowed to enjoy it. If a game is declared politically guilty before release, then this was never a review, it was a verdict. And Lords of the Fallen 2 isn't being judged for what it is, but for what it refuses to be. So there you go, that's the TLDR of the article. Now I'm going to go all the way back up to the top of my notes, and we're going to get into it. Lords of the Fallen 2 is already cementing itself as a game for all the wrong people. Lords of the Fallen 2 publisher CIgames made it blatant back in January that it'll steer clear of making its games political or including any social elements or agendas in its future titles. It claims featuring such things runs a high risk of pushing audiences away, and it would rather focus on serious game features, serious stuff like sexily, scantily clad women, whatever you want, I guess. Just make sure to wash your hands when you're done. This deliberately ignores diverse and inclusive successes like Baldur's Gate 3, which went on to sell 20 million copies, and cherry picks high-profile cases like Concord to justify the belief that the inclusion of queer characters and unconventionally attractive women makes a title fail. Modern games are apparently in such a terrible state not because of greedy executives ballooning budgets and difficult to sustain development cycles, but because the female characters aren't hot enough. Why? That take completely misses the point. The quote tries to use Baldur's Gate 3 as a cultural war cudgel. That alone tells you that the writer fundamentally does not understand why Baldur's Gate 3 succeeded. Baldur's Gate 3 was never political. BG3 exists in the Dungeons & Dragons universe, a system that has for decades been built around player agency, player choice, consent-based roleplay, and you can do it if the table agrees. Queer romances in Baldur's Gate 3 aren't messaging, they're optional outcomes of player choice. Nothing focused, nothing is preached, nothing breaks immersion. That's not politics, that's just core Dungeons & Dragons design policy. Player agency does not equal ideology. Laird Studios didn't include queer characters to make a statement, they followed a simple rule. If the player wants it and it fits the character, let it happen. Let's be blunt, I didn't beat Baldur's Gate 3 10 times because the women weren't hot enough, the cast had queer options, and it checked diversity boxes. I beat it 10 times because the writing is elite, the combat systems are deep, the choice is meaningful and change outcome. Characters react to your decisions, and the game respects my intelligence. BG3 didn't succeed despite inclusion, it succeeded because it was a damn good game. Everything else is just noise. The false comparison to failures. This article tries to cherry pick failures like Concord, which is just a bad game. It was a $40 game. It looked like a bunch of free games that share the exact same plot and just the way they play. Why It's not even that bad of a game. It just shouldn't have been $40 when there are so many other free options. It just bombed because of that. Ignores budget bloat, studio mismanagement, and live service rot. Blames character aesthetic instead of structural problems. That's lazy analysis. Games don't fail because women aren't hot enough. They fail because greedy executives, broken pipelines, trend-chasing design, monetization poisoning gameplay. Baldur's Gate 3 avoided all of that, and it shows. The truth here. Baldur's Gate 3 didn't win Game of the Year because it was inclusive. It won because it respected player agency, honored its source material, and was built by people who actually love games. Trying to use Baldur's Gate 3 as evidence of a cultural war evident in either direction is proof that the writer of this article doesn't understand the game, the genre, or Dungeons & Dragons as a system. And yeah, anyone who's beaten it even once can see that instantly. It's an existing argument that very small yet very loud corners of the game development world cling to with unwavering ignorance, and Lords of the Fallen 2 appears to be leaning on it again. If recent comments from CIgames CEO Marek Tymieniecki are any indication. I played the original Lords of the Fallen, and despite some gameplay and visual qualities in need of improvement and lack of polish, the game had plenty to offer. It was a compelling Soulslike experience with some inventive ideas I'd never seen before, such as a lantern you could shine around an environment to play with alternate realities in real time. Not to mention a robust and weighty combat system. Improving on these qualities would make more than enough for a sequel, but in his pursuit to remove progressive politics and ideas from the game, Tymieniecki has only gone and made Lords of the Fallen 2 political all over again. How ironic. Removing politics from a game makes it political. No, that's not how that works. This quote claims that by trying to remove progressive politics, Lords of the Fallen 2 somehow becomes more political. That's not irony, that's a semantic trap. Here's the sleight of hand that the author is trying to pull here. The author defines politics as progressive ideology, then assumes anything that rejects that ideology is also political, which conveniently means politics can never be removed, only agreed with. That's not analysis, that's reframing disagreement as ideology. Opting out does not equal making a statement. Saying we're not injecting modern political themes into this game is not the same as saying we're making a political argument. By that logic, turning off Twitter is a political act, not commenting on elections is a political act, and making a medieval fantasy game about demons and gods is still political. At that point, the word political is actually just meaningless. What the argument actually says unintentionally. The article isn't proving the game is political, it's accidentally admitting something much worse. Progressive politics are treated as the default state, and deviation from the default is framed as an agenda. So neutrality isn't allowed, silence isn't allowed, focus on gameplay isn't allowed. Only compliance. That's why the logic loops in on itself. The double standard is the tell. If a developer says, we want more diverse representation, that's praised as non-political inclusion. But if the developer says, we want to avoid politics entirely, then suddenly it's reactionary ideology. Same act, different verdict, based solely on alignment. That's not criticism, that's gatekeeping discourse, the actual reality. Here's the reality the article refuses to engage with. The game can focus on mechanics, tone, atmosphere, and fantasy. A game can reject modern real-world messaging. That doesn't automatically turn it into a manifesto. Choosing not to say something is not the same as saying the opposite. If removing politics from the game itself is considered a political act, then politics have become unavoidable, and that tells you more about the critic than the game. Quote, how many of you asked why the game initially had body AB? Said Tymieniecki. Tymieniecki tweeted this past weekend. Quote, Hexworks started early 2020 as an autonomous studio owned by CIgames. Early on, political correctness and filtering meant not every decision reached me on time. I got a lot more involved from late 2024 and now act as head of studio alongside my CEO role, unquote. He went on to say that the AB over male-female was the wrong direction, that Lords of the Fallen 2 will be built on real player feedback, and it's crystal clear in the last 2 trailers. When asked by a user whether the game would include attractive female characters, a short and sweet yes was given in response, which makes it understandingly clear and the sort of audience that Lords of the Fallen 2 is trying to court. What actually happened here? The developer of Lords of the Fallen 2 says the name initially used body type AB. The choice did not come from player feedback. After getting more directly involved, the studio reviewed actual player feedback, determined AB was the wrong direction, switched back to male-female, confirmed the game will include attractive female characters, and pointed to the latest trailer as evidence that this reflects player response. That's not ideology, that's course correction based on audience response. That's game development. And this is where the article starts to lose the plot. The author then says this: it's embarrassingly clear the sort of audience the game is trying to court. And yeah, it is embarrassing clear. The audience, people who play and buy video games. Courting a certain audience only works if the author believes that gamers are a suspect demographic, player feedback is morally compromised, and wanting male-female options is ideological. At this point, the article isn't criticizing design, it's pathologizing player base. Player feedback does not equal dog whistle. And here's the core dishonesty. The article frames this as appealing to reactionary players, when it really is listening to feedback from the majority of your audience. If your argument requires pretending that wanting male-female options is extremist, wanting attractive characters is scandalous, and wanting clarity in character creation is suspect, then the problem isn't the game. The problem is your assumptions about gamers. The AB body type thing. The quiet part out loud. Body type AB wasn't removed because of anti-progressive politics. It was removed because the players didn't like it. It caused confusion. It didn't add gameplay value, and it didn't fit the tone of the world. And instead of accepting that, the author reframes listening to feedback as courting the wrong crowd. That's absurd. The attractive female characters panic. This part is especially unhinged. A dev says yes when asked if they want attractive female characters in the game, and the article treats this as some sort of moral failing. Like, let's be real here, attractive men exist in games. Attractive women exist in games. Attractive demons, elves, vampires, and literal gods exist in games. Karlach exists in games. And this has been true for decades. Treating attractiveness as some kind of ideological sign is not media literacy, it's projection. If listening to player feedback and making characters people actually want to play is courting the wrong crowd, then the audience you don't want is just the gamers. In the big picture here, this article isn't criticizing bugs, combat systems, art design, balance, or level design. It's criticizing who the game is for and doing it in an open contempt. And that's why it reads as completely detached from reality. The uncomfortable truth: this isn't a male-to-male gaze, it's about hitboxes. For a lot of players, especially in action, RPG shooters, Soulslikes, and other games, character choice is mechanical first and aesthetic set second. Smaller frame equals smaller hitbox. Slimmer silhouettes are harder to hit. Less visual clutter around the model, cleaner animations, easier to read in combat. That's not ideology, that's just optimization. Why dudes play female characters? The boring and real reason. This has been true for decades, long before any cultural war nonsense. Female models are often physically smaller. Their animations tend to be tighter. Their movement reads more cleanly in combat. Less bulk equals fewer stray hits. That's why competitive players stick with smaller models, speedrunners favor lean frames, and PvP metas gravitate towards slimmer characters. It's the same reason people pick smaller races in MMOs, characters with narrow shoulders, skinnier silhouettes, and shooters. It's because math beats messaging every time. And the irony the author completely misses here. And if the author's real concern is body diversity, then mechanically speaking, a curvier model with wider hips, chest, and broader wire frame would require a larger hitbox to match the model, which means easier to hit, less optimal, actively worse for gameplay. At that point, you might as well just play as the dude. Not because of attraction, but because there's no mechanical advantage to playing a curvy woman in a video game. Unless she's the only protagonist in the game, and then go for it. But what this reveals about the criticism: the author isn't talking about hitboxes, wireframes, animation clarity, or combat readability. They're projecting aesthetic politics onto systems-driven design. To a gamer, this is a nonsense issue. To a critic, it becomes a moral panic. That disconnect here is everything. A lot of guys don't play female characters because they're horny. They play them because their slimmer models usually have smaller hitboxes. That's a mechanical advantage. You make a build bulkier, you lose advantage. So at that point, you might as well play the male. That's not inflammatory, that's just game literacy. What's the big point here? Gamers don't argue about bodies the way that Twitter does. They argue about DPS, frames, collisions, reads, and advantage. When an article ignores that and jumps straight to what kind of audience is this courting, it exposes how out of touch the analysis really is. This isn't about women being hot enough. It's about what works in combat. Within these ports, Tominski seems to imply that the game perhaps once included a more diverse or even realistic character creator, but anything allegedly woke or progressive was stripped out and replaced with a toolset which mostly restricts players to super buff male protagonists or gorgeous women for them to objectify. By claiming you are removing content you personally deem as political from a piece of art and replacing it with your own, you are creating a new agenda, whether you want to accept it or not. First, notice how it's assumed and not proven. The author says Tominski simply seems to imply and perhaps once included. That's doing a lot of work right there. No evidence is presented that Lords of the Fallen 2 ever had a more realistic character creator. Broader body diversity was removed. System stripped because they were woke. What is documented is the body type AB to male-female, change driven by player feedback, and visual direction aligning with trailers that players responded to positively. Everything else is just projection from the author. Objectify equals telltale word. The moment the author says gorgeous women for them to objectify, they've stopped analyzing design and started moralizing the audience. Here's the problem here. The game also has super buff dudes. Nobody accuses players of objectifying male characters. Nobody claims choosing a muscular male power fantasy is ideological. So why is one framed as neutral fantasy and the other is a moral failure? Because the author has already decided who the wrong players are. The false premise, removing one agenda and adding another. This is the core fallacy, and it's a big one here. By claiming you are removing content you personally deem as political, you are creating a new agenda. No, you're not. That only works if one ideological framework is treated as default. That's the author's ideological framework here. And rejecting it is automatically framed as opposition. That's not neutrality, that's ideological capture. By this logic, a game without politics is impossible. Silence is a statement, focus on gameplay is reactionary, and only approved messages count as apolitical. That's not art criticism, that's a loyalty test. Realistic is doing more heavy lifting than a Souls boss. Let's talk about the realism for a second. This is a game with demons, gods, magic, armor the size of a refrigerator, and protagonists who can roll in full plate mail like Olympic gymnasts. But suddenly body composition is where realism becomes sacred. Come on, I mean, Realistic here doesn't mean physically accurate, it means ideologically preferred, and gamers can smell that instantly. The quiet insult to players. Here's what the paragraph is really saying. Players don't make mechanical or aesthetic choices. Players are driven by base urges. Players can't separate fantasy from values. Developers shouldn't listen to them. Which leads to the same conclusion we already nailed earlier. The wrong audience is just gamers. And that's it. That's the whole thing. Removing ideology isn't replacing it with another agenda, unless you believe one ideology is default and disagreement is disallowed. And why this matters here. This article isn't defending art, it's defending control over interpretation. It's saying developers can only make choices if they align correctly. Player feedback is suspicious, popular taste is morally compromised, and deviating from approved framework is political. That's not progressive, that's authoritarian criticism dressed up as concern. It stinks of fake outrage, trying desperately to sell a 7 out of 10 Soulslike by playing it up to the idea that the modern gaming landscape has somehow robbed straight male audiences of traditional experiences they now have a responsibility to take back. A similar thing occurred with Shift Up's Stellar Blade, which was held up as a symbol of resistance in the modern culture war. The game wasn't afraid to put an incredibly gorgeous heroine front and center, whose chest, butt, and overall figure existed as objects for players to obsess over and customize. This is the straw man they need to exist. The author claims developers are selling to straight male audiences, suggesting something that has been taken from them, framing gamers as having a responsibility to take it back. None of that is actually happening here. The narrative exists almost entirely in the author's imagination. No dev statement says this, no marketing copy says this, no trailers imply this. This is a manufactured motive, a classic culture war straw man. The 7 out of 10 Souls-like tell. Calling a game a 7 out of 10 Souls-like before release isn't critique, it's a preemptive dismissal. That's the rhetorical trick here. Declare a game mid, accuse it of culture war panding, implying its success, if any, is ideological and not deserved. That way, no matter what happens, if it sells well, it was culture war grift. If it doesn't, proof that gamers are wrong. It's unfallaciable. That's not analysis. The Stellar Blade comparison and where it fully breaks. Dragging Stellar Blade into this is especially telling. And here's the reality here. Shift Up didn't make Stellar Blade as a resistance. The devs didn't wage a culture war, they just made a stylish action game with an attractive protagonist. The internet turned it into a symbol, the developers did not. Blaming the game for how other people argued online is like blaming a movie for YouTube thumbnails. Objectification is doing all the work again. Notice the framing. Attractive male power fantasy equals neutral. Attractive female protagonist, objects to obsess over. That double standard is never interrogated. Games have always featured exaggerated bodies. Kratos, Dante, Geralt. Every Souls protagonist is built like a brick wall. Nobody accuses players of objectifying them because that would be absurd. So why does the framing of only one activate here? Because the author isn't mad about design, they're mad about who enjoys it. The core problem here, contempt for the audience. This paragraph isn't defending games, it's scolding players. It assumes that gamers are politically motivated by default. The enjoyment of aesthetics is a moral failure. Liking attractive characters equals obsession, and players need to be managed instead of listened to. That's why it reads like fake outrage instead of, because it is, outrage at the audience and not for the art. This isn't criticism of games, it's resentment toward people who play them, dressed up as cultural concern. Why this kind of writing backfires. Articles like this don't protect art, improve discourse, help developers, or encourage better games. They just convince players that critics don't like them, don't understand them, and aren't worth listening to. And honestly, paragraphs like this make that case all on their own. There was a belief among certain audiences that the video game critics and progressive gamers were looking to tear down Stellar Blade, believing it stood against DEI agenda. We'd been slowly but surely infecting the entire medium with, but instead, it reviewed incredibly well and sold millions of copies, and now a sequel is even in production. Personally, I enjoyed Stellar Blade and even thought Eve was a fun and attractive main character with loads of cool outfits and unlocks. The author just pulled the rug out from under her own argument. She admits all of the following about Stellar Blade. It reviewed incredibly well. It sold millions. A sequel is in production. She personally enjoyed it. The protagonist was fun and attractive, and the outfits were cool and enjoyable. That should be the end of the discussion right there. But by her own admission, attractive female protagonists do not harm games. They do not doom reviews, they do not prevent commercial success, and they do not reduce artistic merit. So what exactly is she arguing against here? Because she keeps railing on about attractive female characters in this Soulslike. But here she is, Stellar Blade 2. Oh, I really liked it. It had a really attractive female character. What is she arguing against here? The answer, not the design, the interpretation. She's not actually mad that Eve is attractive, players like her design, and the game leaned into aesthetics. She's mad that other people framed it differently than how she wanted it. Notice the pivot here. The problem isn't Stellar Blade. The problem is that certain audiences believed it stood against DEI. The outrage is aimed at player reactions, not the game itself. So now we're no longer critiquing design choices. We're policing how players are allowed to interpret and enjoy them. That's the shift here. The core contradiction is the kill shot. Attractive female protagonists are fine, actually, unless players like them for the wrong reasons or interpret them in ways that I don't approve of. That's it. That's the entire problem with this paragraph here. The design is acceptable, the success is acceptable, the enjoyment is acceptable, the audience reaction is not. Throughout this piece, the author keeps doing this. Condemns attractive female characters as objectification, then praises the game because the character is attractive. Condemns a dev for courting a certain type of audience, then admits the game succeeded because of broad appeal. Frames culture war backlash as imaginary while repeatedly invoking it herself. That's not coherent position, that's vibes-based criticism. You can't argue that attractive female protagonists are harmful while celebrating that a game succeeded because of one, unless the real reason isn't the design, but who you think is allowed to enjoy it. That's the contradiction. What she's actually defending. At the end of the day, this article isn't about defending women, artistic freedoms, representation, DEI, or even Stellar Blade. It's about controlling the narrative around success. If a game succeeds without the correct framing, the success becomes suspicious. And that's why the article feels so hollow here, because it accidentally proving the opposite of what it's trying to say. And so the culture war moved on to a new target. And to this day, the cycle continues. Lords of the Fallen 2 is a special case, however, because the developers behind the sequel seem to believe that cultivating this movement is going to make their game more successful. Either that, or they truly believe in the nonsense they are spouting. This game is not about progressive politics or a agency of players regarding their agenda or politics, but about fierce combat, uncompromisingly attractive female characters, and a world worth getting lost in. The irony is that in Timonisky's laughably pursuit of stripping Lords of the Fallen 2 of every single trace of diversity, he has turned the game into an object of political ridicule long before it stands in our laps. It will be remembered for that and nothing more. They said attractive female characters again here, dripping in sarcasm, obviously, and I'm assuming stripping Lords of the Fallen 2 of every single trace of diversity is the author's way of saying this game doesn't meet my political standard, so no one should play it. Uncompromisingly attractive female characters, said like an insult. By this point, the phrase attractive female characters isn't descriptive anymore. It's being used diversively. Not neutrally, not analytically, but for shorthand for this game has failed my ideological purity test. The repetition here matters. The sarcasm matters. She's not critiquing a design choice, she's mocking the existence of it. And that tells you everything you need to know. Stripping every single trace of diversity equals redefining reality. Here's the trick she's pulling. Diversity is no longer about different factions, monsters, cultures, classes, body armors, armor styles, body builds, or play styles. It's been reduced to a single political checklist here. If the game doesn't conform to that checklist, then magically it has no diversity at all. That's not criticism, that's redefining terms to force a verdict. The quiet ultimatum underneath the paragraph. This game doesn't meet my political standard, therefore it deserves ridicule, and players should feel bad for engaging with it. Notice what she doesn't do here. She doesn't analyze combat, she doesn't analyze level design, she doesn't analyze systems, she doesn't analyze progression, she doesn't even analyze enemy variety. She declares the game politically contaminated before release and then predicts it will be remembered for nothing more. That's not a review, that's kind of a death sentence. Culture war accusation is projection. She claims that developers are cultivating the culture war, but who keeps invoking it? She does, repeatedly, unprompted, and even while admitting that the game is about combat and atmosphere. The devs talk about gameplay, player feedback, tone, and aesthetic direction. She talks about movements, ideology, ridicule, and moral failure. One side is making the game, the other side is making a narrative. The big tell here is it will be remembered for that and nothing more. This line isn't prediction, it's wish fulfillment. It's saying, I hope this game fails, and I want its failure framed the way I want. That's not criticism rooted in love of medium, it's a resentment for that medium that didn't ask permission. At this point, diversity doesn't mean variety or inclusion, it means ideological compliance. And if a game doesn't comply, the conclusion is already written before anyone touches a controller. That's the whole thesis here, really. Final reality check. Lords of the Fallen 2 isn't being condemned for what it is. It's being condemned for what it isn't willing to be. And yeah, that's why this article doesn't read as a thoughtful critique. It reads as fake outrage, desperately trying to stay relevant. Gamers didn't start this culture war. They're just being blamed for not losing it. Anyways, guys, that's been it for today. I'm going to get out of here. If you like what we do here, like, comment, subscribe. Let me know down below what you think of this video. Let me know if you think the author had an insanely bad take. I mulled it over for about 2 hours before I finally decided to fire up the camera and make something about this, because this is just, it's bad. Like bad. Anyways, I'm going to get out of here. Check out the merch bar down below. Pick yourself up something nice for Christmas. It won't ship for Christmas, I can promise you that, but you might get it for New Year's, I don't know, but pick yourself up some nice merch down there. If you want, you can also hit up the PayPal link, donate me something for an energy drink. You don't have to. I always appreciate it when you do, though. Anyways, guys, I'm going to get out of here. I hope you have a good night or a good rest of your day, whatever time of day it is. I hope you have a good part of it. Anyways, see you later, guys.